Welcome everyone to day 29. This podcast will cover parts of chapter 24 and will focus on objective 1. For this unit of material since our last exam, we focus primarily on how populations evolve. In this chapter, for this day, we're going to talk about how species arise. There are many different kinds of definitions of species, and we're going to focus on the biological species concept. Now, this species concept states that a species is a group of populations whose members have the potential to interbreed, and that their progeny will be viable and they'll be fertile. However, these populations cannot make fertile and viable offspring with other groups of organisms. Okay, let's talk about this term called reproductive isolation. Now, as your book describes this, reproductive isolation is needed to produce new species. So I'm going to write produce new species. More specifically, reproductive isolation says that there are biological factors or barriers, so I'm going to put barriers, that prevent two species from interbreeding. So barriers, and I'm going to draw an arrow saying two species can't interbreed. And so what do I mean by this? Well, let's draw a large area here, and let's draw some species. So we have these two populations of green species, and let's say the green ones are the same species. And so you could imagine that within this population there's going to be a lot of interbreeding here, and you would even imagine every now and then we'd get some gene flow between these two populations. Now let's say there were some mountains here, perhaps, maybe a lake of some sort. But whatever it is, it's blocking these two populations, the red population. And so it could be easily seen, I think, that there would be no gene transfer between these two species. And let's say at one time they were the same species. But after many thousands of generations, what happens is, since they're no longer in contact with each other anymore, each of them are going to go down different adaptative pathways. And so we will end up with two new species. This is kind of, I think, maybe the easier way to kind of understand reproductive isolation. What makes it more difficult, though, to understand is if you have, say, a neighboring species right next to this one. That they could interbreed, but they can't for some reason. And we'll talk about what some of those reasons are. You might even imagine another population, right in the middle of this other population. Yet they don't interbreed, and over time they become separate species. One time they were the same species, but for some reason they are prevented from interbreeding. There is some kind of barrier. Again, it's easy to see a mountain as a barrier to prevent interbreeding. It's more difficult to understand how species in the same area or in neighboring areas don't interbreed because of these barriers. Two types, broad categories of barriers that we're going to talk about include pre-zygotic barriers. And pre-zygotic means that the barrier exists before fertilization. So barrier before fertilization. That is before the zygote forms. The next one is called post-zygotic. And this means that the barrier exists after fertilization. And as we'll see, barriers don't necessarily mean a physical barrier. They can be other kinds of barriers. So let's look at some pre-zygotic barriers, and we're going to talk about 5 different pre-zygotic barriers. So let's go ahead and list them here. The first one is habitat isolation. The second one is temporal isolation. Temporal just means time. So this is an isolation that's going to be based upon time. Then the next one is behavioral isolation. The fourth one is mechanical isolation. And then the last one here is gametic isolation. Now remember, all of these are pre-zygotic isolation. So the first one, we'll talk about it on this page. We'll have to move to other pages to talk about all of them. But let's talk about lizards. And let's say we have a tree here. Let's give it some kind of leaves up here. All right, that's a beautiful tree. Now let's draw some lizards. And let's say we have some, I'm just going to draw them as ovals here. Let's say we have a lizard population here, a large population of lizards that live down here. Then let's say we have lizards that live in the tree. Let's say we have lizards that live in the tree. And then let's draw, let's say there's a lake way over here. Not too far. They could walk to each other. And these lizards live on the edge of the lake here. So these different lizard populations share the same basic geography. However, they have different habitats that they live in. These lizards live in the tree. These live in the shrubbery. These live over here by a lake. They are reproductively isolated because they never interact with each other because they have different habitats. Over time, because of this reproductive isolation, they can now become different lizard species. And so over time, let's just make these different. We'll give these guys little red spots. These will give stripes, just to indicate that they have become different species over time. Okay, let's look at our next example. Our next example would be temporal isolation. So let's write that up here. All right, let's talk about our second one here. And this second one is temporal isolation. Temporal isolation means that two different populations, they have different breeding times. Okay, they breed at different times. These different times could be into terms of different times of the day. Certain flowers will open up at different times of the day. This could be a temporal mechanism. Different times of the year, even different years. Or different seasons, I should say. So we could draw another forest here. I'm going to draw the trunks first, then change colors. So we have this forest. All I can say is my trees are probably better than the animals I draw. Your book gives a good example here of the western and the eastern skunk. And let's just say that these two skunks happen to be in the same forest. And they may interact with each other. They may hang out with each other. They may play with each other. They may fight with each other. And so I'm going to put a W here, and an eastern here. These are all skunks. And at one time, they were the same species. But what has happened is that the western skunk mates in late summer. So I'm going to write late summer here. So the western, and I'm going to just put a W here for western, the western skunk mates in the late summer, whereas the eastern skunk mates in the late winter. Because they are mating at different times of the year, even though they're interacting with each other, they are never going to mate with each other. And over time, what happens is that they become different species. So let's just kind of make them look different here. It takes a while, of course. It's not immediately, it's certainly not within the next generation. But because they have different breeding seasons, they will never breed with each other. They can be friends, they can hang out, but they're not going to breed with each other. And so over time, they become different species. Now let's talk about our third mechanism, behavioral isolation. A good example of this is mating courtship rituals. There's a lot of examples of these. Your book talks about the blue-footed boobies in the Galapagos, and they have a very elaborate mating courtship dance that allows them to recognize only certain desirable mates. I got like an example of looking at frogs. And so what I want to do now is I'm going to cut away to a quick video here, and I want you to listen to this pond. Okay, I'm going to start this video here in just a moment, and what we're going to see are, well, we're going to hear first several croaking noises. I don't know if they're all frogs, but there's certainly a lot of frogs in this pond, and you'll hear a lot of croakings. You'll see male and female frogs croaking, and you'll see some of them trying to go after each other and attempting to mate, and you'll see some not. And what you'll notice is that the different croaking noises will attract different kinds of frogs. So let's go ahead and watch this for a little bit here. As you can see from listening to that, all of those frogs within that pond area, so here's our pond here, and we're going to have frogs over here. We'll have frogs over here, here. Well, let's just draw them all around the pond here. In the pond, right? They're all over the place. However, they all have different kind of mating rituals, different kind of croaking behaviors. And because of that, what will happen is that they will only recognize certain mates. And so let's say that this one here makes a certain noise, and let's indicate that with a asterisk here. Or let's do an X. It's making an X noise, and so is this one. And this one. And so the females are going to recognize that one here, this noise here. However, maybe this one is making a different noise, and let's indicate this with a red dot above them. Even though they're living with each other, the females are not going to respond to the wrong mating behavior, the wrong courtship ritual. Because of this behavior of the different frogs within this same pond are going to attract different mates. And because of that, they will be reproductively isolated from the others. If a female recognizes this one here, she's not going to recognize these two. She may hear them, but this is the one she goes after. So this is behavioral isolation. And this next one is called mechanical isolation. This is an interesting one. This is one where mating occurs, or rather I should say mating is attempted, but fails because of a mechanical or morphological difference. Your book gives a really great example in this case of two species of snails. These snails, they live in the same community. They live right next to each other. They interact with each other. So let's just draw snail 1 here. And we'll draw snail 2 here. What happens is, I'll draw snail 2 first. Its whorls goes in a clockwise direction. And we'll draw the snail here. That's a great looking snail. Its whorls go in the opposite direction. They go in a counterclockwise direction. So the two may still meet. They may like each other, if snails can like each other. They may even attempt to mate. But because of this difference in whorl, what happens is that their genital openings don't match up. They are not aligned with each other. So they can try all they want, but in the end they'll fail because the genital openings do not align correctly for successful reproduction. Mating is attempted, but it fails. And so this, of course, is very sad. These two may have been the same species, but over time, because they could not mate with each other, they become reproductively isolated and now can become different species. Okay, this last one is called gametic isolation. And this is when mating occurs. So mating occurs, but for several different reasons, the sperm cannot fertilize the egg. So let's attempt to draw a sperm here, and then here's the egg. And as it's going towards this path, it is blocked. Now, it could be blocked for several reasons. Perhaps the environment is fatal. It kills the sperm. It could be more acidic. It could be, so I'm going to just write dies. The sperm dies. And again, it could die because the environment is, the pH is different, the temperature is different. Whatever it is, it does not make it here because it dies. Another case could be that the sperm actually finds the egg, but cannot penetrate the egg for various reasons. Maybe the outside of the egg is different, that only allows certain sperm to be able to penetrate it. The book gives a pretty good example here of sea urchins. So what sea urchins do is they will draw one. This is in the ocean. And then we have our sea urchin here. Not a very good one. They'll release sperm and egg. And we may have a different species of sea urchin that releases sperm and egg. And maybe some genetic modification produced a sperm and an egg that have a different coating on the outside that prevents this sperm from fertilizing this egg, or this egg from being fertilized by this sperm. This allowed each of these sea urchins to develop into new species. And now, when they're right next to each other, it's convenient because the same general body of water will contain both sets of sperm and egg. But it will prevent these two species from forming a hybrid species of the two because, again, the outside of this egg will not accept the coating of this sperm. Again, this is the fifth reproductive isolative mechanism that produces new species. And it's our last prezygotic mechanism. Let's now think about after fertilization. There are three mechanisms for post-zygotic, and let's list them first before we describe them. The first is reduced hybrid viability. The second is reduced hybrid fertility. The third, it is hybrid breakdown. All three of these mechanisms allow the fertilization of the egg by the sperm to form the zygote. And then something happens that either prevents that zygote from forming developing, or allows the zygote to develop, and then there's something wrong with that hybrid. Remember, a hybrid is just when two species breed and produce a progeny. Let's briefly talk about reduced hybrid viability. And again, we could have an environment. Your book talks about salamanders, so let's talk about salamanders. Let's draw a lake here, and we may have different salamanders. Let's draw them like so, living together. And they may actually mate, and they may produce a hybrid. So we actually form a zygote. So I'm going to draw this zygote here. Of course, we're talking about different size scales here. The zygote is not as big as the lake. So this is our zygote formed between this green and the red salamanders here. And usually what would happen is that this would go on to develop into a baby salamander. But in the examples of reduced hybrid viability, so this is the hybrid zygote, but somewhere along this pathway, it breaks down. It does not form a baby salamander. Something about this hybrid is incompatible for survival. So it never reaches the state of the baby. As a result, these two salamanders can live in the same area. They can mate, but they don't produce hybrids. Over time, these salamanders become different species because of that. Let's talk about the second one now. And the second one is reduced hybrid fertility. The classic example here is when a male donkey and a female horse produce a mule. So a male donkey plus a female horse, can't be the other way around, produce a mule. This mule survives, and it's a lot shorter than the other two. It looks different than the other two. It's healthy. It can serve a function, but they are sterile. I should tell you, just in case you hear it later on, that every now and then you can get a mule that is fertile, and that there's a genetic explanation that's not really relevant for this class. But in general, the mule that is produced is sterile. So again, this is the zygote is formed, so it's post-zygotic, but we don't produce a new species because of it, because they are not viable. I'm sorry, they are not fertile. Remember, the definition of the biological concept of a species is that they have to be able to produce viable and fertile offspring. So this fails because the offspring are not fertile. The previous one, reduced hybrid viability, fails because even though they can produce the zygote, it's not viable. Now this last one, let's just go and put it down on the bottom here, is called hybrid breakdown. This is a little more difficult to understand, and we see it more in plants. And you could have species A here of one plant and another one B. And they actually form a hybrid, and we'll call it AB. In plants, we often form hybrids, and often these hybrids work out quite well. However, in hybrid breakdown, what happens is that this hybrid AB will produce progeny. So this hybrid now can produce progeny, either with other AB hybrids or with a parental strain. And now these progeny fail. They are feeble, or not healthy, I should say, and sterile. So they're able to produce one hybrid generation, but after that, this hybrid breaks down. So again, it fails at the biological concept of a species because it does not produce viable and fertile offspring in this second generation. All right, that ends this first podcast on for day 29. If you have any questions, please let us know. We'll see you in class. Bye.